My son, Robbie, had been going through a rough patch. His girlfriend had left him, and his cat of 15 years had just died. He loved that cat as if it were his own child. It slept next to him every night, curled up in his arms like a teddy bear. I knew he was using opiates as well, and no matter how much we tried to help him, he simply couldn't stop. But a couple weeks ago, things started getting better. Robbie looked a lot happier. He seemed to have hope again. I saw him smiling and laughing, and I figured he had gotten over the hump. "I see things clearly now," he said to me and his mother over breakfast one morning. I smiled. "That's good. Suffering makes you a stronger man," I said. "No great man has ever lived without great suffering to first harden him." He nodded. I went to bed early, confident that things were looking up. I was sleeping that night when I heard the gunshot. No, I heard my wife shriek in an agonized voice, the voice of a mother losing her child, her only child. The sound seemed to go on, and I think I still hear it sometimes. When I close my eyes, that maybe it never really stopped. She screamed like a woman on fire. I sprinted towards the noise, my feet feeling as heavy as cinder blocks. "Alexis," I cried into the dark hallway. My heart felt like a cold chunk of ice in my chest. I ran blindly through the shadows, knocking a vase off a table as I passed. It exploded on the floor with a sound like bones shattering. "What's wrong?" My voice sounded like someone else's. Everything seemed slow and dreamlike. I wasn't sure whether this was really happening to me. I felt totally dissociated from everything, a state that would continue for days afterward. The only response that came to my calls was more hysterical sobbing and incoherent screaming. I flew through Robbie's open bedroom door and saw a scene from a nightmare. A shotgun was sprawled at his feet, thrown onto the hardwood floor like a discarded toy. Robbie sat in a recliner, and his face was almost entirely gone. I saw deeply into his skull and brain matter. He had blown off everything from the top of his mouth to his nose to his right eye and right cheek. His forehead had imploded like a smashed pumpkin. The left eye gazed sightlessly ahead, wide open, and as blank as a statue's. I felt a tight constriction in my chest. I grabbed at it, falling over. I remember the darkness, interspersed with flashing lights, and voices from 1,000 miles away piercing the void. I reached out, trying to escape, but the darkness seemed eternal. I woke up in the hospital surrounded by the sounds of beeping machines and soft footsteps. I opened my eyes and found myself in a hospital bed. A few minutes later, a doctor came in and told me I had suffered a mild heart attack and would undoubtedly have some permanent heart damage. However, my wife, even though physically unscathed, was in even worse shape. I remember walking to the psychiatric ward a few days later. My heart still felt tight and constricted as if the cage of bones around it had clenched down with their finger-like ribs. The nurse was a large woman dressed in faded green scrubs and had a face like a tired weasel. Her brown eyes looked out at me from drooping facial features. Her many chins wriggled and danced as she led me through the hallways of madness. I passed by a schizophrenic man in his early 20s. He talked to himself, walking in circles. He reminded me of people I had seen on bad acid trips, except his trip never ended. I saw the birds, green birds in the mountains. Sightless eyes are green too. Why do they always drink from the poisoned stream? A lunatic god with sightless eyes. I see. I passed on by, extremely interested. I wanted to ask the young man more, but the nurse kept hurrying me along, and then I remembered the grim circumstances I was actually there for. My wife was in the room at the end of the hall. It was Spartan. Only a desk, dresser, and bed stood there, all nailed to the floor. Laying on the bed, I saw my wife. Her arms were extended up towards the ceiling like a child asking to be picked up by a parent. She didn't move or speak. She appeared as an eerie, living statue, laying there with open eyes. Her breath came in slow, steady rasps. "She is in a catatonic state," someone said from behind me. I turned, seeing a doctor in a white lab coat entering the room. He had striking blue eyes the color of an Arctic glacier, and deep wrinkles around his aristocratic mouth. His hawk-like nose gave his face a serious, reflective character. He walked over to Alexis. Her once golden skin looked pale and lifeless. Her eyes had sunk deep into her face like the last bit of water at the bottom of a deep well. "She has what we call waxy flexibility." He took her left wrist and, like moving the joint of a mannequin, pushed her arm down towards the bed so it was at a 45-degree angle to the mattress instead of a 90-degree angle. Her arm hung there, unmoving. It was eerie seeing my wife turned into a doll, her mind apparently shattered. "How long?" I said through a hoarse, choked voice. I felt drained from my stay in the hospital And the trauma of the last few days. How long will she be like this, doctor? He looked away. I'm sorry, but that's impossible to say, he said. We are doing everything we can. However, we are giving her electroshock therapy. Electroshock? I asked, aghast. He nodded grimly. This is usually a sign of schizophrenia. Does she have a history of mental illness? I shrugged. Not that I know of, I said. Traumatic incidents can sometimes trigger it in people who are genetically predisposed, he said in an impassive voice. It's possible she has had symptoms before and simply hid them. He never noticed strange behavior like paranoia or disordered speech or hallucinations. Well, I said, thinking back to the incident last month, she did say something about seeing a ghost in Robbie's bedroom. A ghost, the doctor said, his mouth hanging open slightly. He quickly regained his regal bearing, giving a slight smile. That could certainly be a sign of hallucinations. Did she physically see the ghost standing there? Did she talk to it or have contact with it? I thought back to that strange night. Thinking of Robbie again brought back a sick, empty feeling in my heart. I saw someone peeking in through the window, Alexis whispered in a quivering voice, her dark eyes wide and afraid. The window of Robbie's room. I jumped up from the chair, taking out my phone and keeping 911 on the screen so that I could press send and start the call immediately if necessary. I ran into the master bedroom, pulling clothes up from my dresser to reveal the rifle hidden there underneath. It was a beautiful gun, a Springfield 2020 Redline. I always kept it loaded in case of an intruder. Taking it out, I flicked off the safety. With my phone screen still turned on in my pocket, sprinted into Robbie's room. Robbie's room was on the 3rd floor, but I never second-guessed Alexis. She was brutally honest, almost to the point of absurdity. She wouldn't even use her sick time at work unless she was actually sick, because she felt bad about lying to her manager. So when she said something, I instantly believed it. My mind raced. I wondered if someone had a ladder against the side of the house and was trying to break in. It was the only thing that made sense, after all, unless Jesus had decided to descend back down from the clouds and fly around for a while. I looked in Robbie's empty room. For a moment, I thought I saw something skeletal peeking over the edge of the sill. It seemed to have eyes like a possum caught in the headlights, glowing in eerie cataract white. I thought I caught a glimpse of writhing snakes twisting lazily in the breeze, their eyes open, and mouths tightly pressed together as if in expressions of disapproval. I blinked and found the window empty. I strode over and looked down, seeing nothing. I went back and told Alexis there was nothing there. Her lithe body felt light and free as I wrapped my arms around her, hugging her. She began to cry, her shaking chest pressed tight to mine. After getting home from visiting Alexis in the psychiatric ward, I found myself alone in the sprawling house. It felt eerie. My footsteps seemed to echo far too loudly in my ears. I had decided to investigate Robbie's room. In the silence, I could always hear my own damaged heart, each beat like a sand grain in an hourglass flowing toward death. But perhaps that was a good thing. Perhaps I would see my mother and father again, my grandparents, my old dog, my son, and all the others I had lost. I remembered a story my friend Angela had told me after she had converted to Buddhism. She had lost her daughter in a drunk driving crash a few years earlier. She had started to lose her mind in worsening waves of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. Yet a few months later, when I had talked to her, I found her eyes bright, and her mind recovered. She had the look of a true fanatic, yet she also emanated a peace I had rarely seen. She told me a story I would never forget. The Buddha once had a similar case in the ancient scriptures. A woman had gone mad with grief over the loss of her only son. She would walk the town, her mind shattered, screaming for her boy. So the Buddha was in the area. The woman came to him, weeping, asking him to bring her son back. The Buddha said he would bring her son back, but that he needed her to find an ingredient for the ritual first. She had to find a grain of rice from a house that had never lost a loved one. She wandered the area, asking every person she could find if they had never lost a loved one. But they all told her, no, I lost a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, a son, a daughter. The woman went back to the Buddha and told him she could not find a single house where death and loss had not taken place. She began to realize that death and suffering was universal for all beings in every moment, and her mind began to clear. So it is, the Buddha said, so it is. Grief, suffering, lamentation, and stress come from one who is dear, from those who we love. But true bliss comes from not clinging, from not craving, from non-attachment to all things. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the freshly painted white door to Robbie's room. The place looked Spartan now. The blood and gore had stained many of his possessions. I had a professional cleaning company come in and throw them away. The hardwood floors had also been ripped up and replaced in the worst areas, where massive puddles of blood had dripped through the cracks. Tears came to my eyes. I inhaled for a long moment, blinking my eyes fast to try to clear them. I saw his notebooks on a bookshelf in the corner. I went over, looking through them until I found a slim, black volume titled Diary. As I flipped to the first page, a drawing of Robbie sleeping as something hideous with melting skin and glowing eyes lay next to him. This abomination wasn't sleeping, however. It stared right at Robbie with excited, lidless eyes and grinned. Next to it, I saw some verses scrawled in Robbie's spiky, copperplate handwriting. It was an old poem written by one of his favorite poets, Gene Jones. I had heard Robbie recite it from memory a while back, and it had given me the creeps. On top of the page stood the title in large, slashing letters. The angel of death sleeps beside me. At night, her black hair and dark eyes stare at me like photographs I have hanging from the wall. She is a skull, grinning constantly at me. She is smiling, and her eyes flash every time she stares at me. I am in love with her. I want to go where she goes, where normal women can never go. The place where we all meet in the end. The harvest ground, the wet, cold earth. There is tiredness to this land, and everything in me feels it. From the way I pour sugar in my coffee every morning to the time it takes for me to close my eyes and remember nothing. Everything is nothing to that smile you have, though. I want to go and find out where it comes from. Show me. I sat on the couch in the living room, looking at the empty ashtrays sitting on the table. One doctor with a face like a shriveled grape had told me I needed to quit smoking. His ancient eyes looked like chips of flat sapphire as he reiterated over and over how lucky I was that my heart attack was mild and didn't require surgery. Instead, they had given me aspirin, nitroglycerin, morphine, and blood thinners. Though the damage to my heart was permanent, it was fairly minor, but he stated that if I kept smoking a couple packs a day and not exercising, it would very likely be serious or even fatal next time. I sighed, nervously taking some nicotine gum and chewing it as Robbie's journal lay on the coffee table in front of me. Its cover looked shiny and dangerous like the black skin of some venomous centipede. Steeling myself, I opened it and continued reading. She comes in different forms, he had written, and that was very nearly the last thing he had written in the entire diary. All of the unlined pages had drawings. After that, he was a very talented artist, and I had often encouraged him to continue drawing and painting. The first drawing showed a van. Its headlights looked like staring, cataract-covered eyes. In its interior, teeth hung down from the ceiling, dripping saliva. More razor-sharp fangs stuck up from the floor. A couple and a young child sat huddled in the back seat, their mouths opened in silent screams as the back of the van had started to crush and close in on the family. I flipped to the next one. It showed an abomination hovering over the ground, its shadow reaching out like prodding fingers behind it. Its head was twisted around backwards so that I couldn't see its face. It had giant, reptilian wings stretching out on both sides of its body like the wings of a bat, spiky and sharp and framed with narrow, curving bones. It wore a shimmering black robe and had dozens of eels or snakes growing out of its skull. Each of them had dead, white eyes and sharp, dripping fangs. Sickened, I kept flipping, finding more and more disturbing images. Finally, I got to the last page. I saw what might have been a self-portrait of Robbie, but everything looked wrong. His teeth were colored black. His eyes shone like polished silver, full of sadistic glee and lunacy. The fingernails had become dark talons. A forked tongue peeked out through the thin lips. Underneath, in small letters, he had written, "The angel of death is a scream wrapped up in a dark, sickly thing. She is eternity." I couldn't sleep that night. I stood pacing, watching TV, and chewing nicotine gum. I wanted a cigarette very badly. I kept thinking of my wife, wondering if she had woken up from her catatonic state yet. A small voice in the back of my head wondered if she would ever wake up from it, but I quickly banished it to the darkness of my subconscious. At 3:33 a.m., I heard a crashing sound at the front door. I jumped, sending my water glass shattering on the floor. It sounded as if someone had taken a sledgehammer to the door. The wood bowed inwards as if it were made of cardboard. Another knock came, sending deep cracks skittering through it like the fault lines of an earthquake. I got up from the living room couch and ran upstairs, grabbing my rifle and some extra magazines. A minute later, the third knock came, and I heard the wood give a tortured shriek as the door splintered into 1,000 pieces far below. My breath caught in my throat. "Dad," Robbie's voice cried. It sounded sickly and diseased, as if he had been gargling with razor blades. His voice came out distorted and eerie, but I still recognized the voice as my son's. I didn't answer. I hid in the master bedroom with the door locked and the rifle pointed straight at it. I heard heavy, plodding footsteps smashing against the first floor, circling around and looking for something, looking for me. I looked in the bedroom mirror, seeing myself a pale, thin man with black circles under his eyes, his body trembling and weak. The gun felt like a paltry piece of junk in my shaking hands. Whatever was impersonating Robbie started to ascend the stairs. I heard the wood groaning and straining as his inhumanly heavy footsteps shook the house, coming closer and closer. Finally, he arrived at the other side of the door. "Dad," Robbie gurgled. "Open up. It's time." Something smashed against the door as if an anvil had been thrown at it. The door broke along the middle, sending spidery cracks surging up and down the sides of it. I knew one more good hit would break it. Inhaling deeply, I opened fire. The ear-splitting cacophony of emptying an entire chamber as quickly as I could instantly deafened me. The smell of gunsmoke hung thick in the air, but behind it, I smelled something else, something much fouler, almost like tomatoes, and roadkill left out to rot together under a hot summer sun. The ringing in my ears had begun to subside as I took out the empty magazine, throwing it and slamming another one into the chamber. Like a man waking up from a dream, I remembered the phone in my pocket. I quickly took it out and dialed 911. It rang for what seemed like an eternity, but then finally someone picked up. "Oh, thank God," I screamed. "Please send help. I'm under attack at." "Dad," the distorted voice hissed through the phone. "Is that you, Dad? It's so dark and cold here. I don't know where I am." I froze, the phone slipping out of my numb fingers and hitting the floor. "Go away," I screamed at the top of my lungs. "Leave me alone." I could feel my heart tightening and anxiety rising in my chest. I was supposed to be relaxing after my heart attack. For a long moment, I wondered if this would cause another one that I would never wake up from. Without warning, the door shattered inwards, raining splinters of wood down on my head. Standing on the dark threshold, I saw my son, but his eyes were white and covered in pale cataracts. He grinned, showing a mouthful of black teeth. I saw a forked, blood-red tongue in that horrible face he used over the threshold. I was too stunned to react for a long moment. Abruptly, he ran at me, his mouth opening far too wide as if the tendons and ligaments in his jaw had been sliced. The snake-like tongue flicked from his unhinged mouth, a hissing emanating from deep in his chest. The smell of rotting meat became overwhelming. I raised the gun, but he smashed into me at full speed. The rifle went sliding under the bed. Unbalanced, I fell on my back, my arms pinwheeling. Gnashing his obsidian teeth, he landed on top of me. He bit at the air like a rabid dog. I had my elbow against his neck, but his strength seemed overwhelming. He slowly lowered his gnashing, biting mouth towards my face. The smell from his breath nearly made me sick, a rank odor of sulfur and infected wounds and fetid swamps. I couldn't fight his strength as he came within inches of my face. I tried to pull away, wrenching my neck to the side. In a blur, he snapped down and his jaw slammed together with a sound like a pistol going off. I felt a cold, searing pain where my right ear used to be. Warm blood gushed out of the wound. With a spike of adrenaline, I reached into my pocket with my left hand and grabbed my house key. Screaming an insane battle cry, I brought it up and into the thing's white, blind eye. The eye exploded. Something cold and squirming with maggots ran over my fingers. The creature pulled back suddenly, and I used the movement to my advantage, pushing at it with all of my strength. He fell off me and I jumped up, my adrenaline spiking. Blood continued to soak my shirt as I ran out of the house. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could, constantly checking the rearview mirror. I decided to drive as far as I could and never come back, but I doubted whether it would keep the abomination from returning. The winter wind whipped over the empty streets as I fled, blowing flakes of ice and snow across the dead earth. Covered in blood and shell-shocked, I listened as it howled with the cold agonies and unheard voices of the damned.